Scripture and folk wisdom is full of stories of strangers who give unexpected gifts. We just heard one such story from the Jewish tradition and one such scripture from the Christian tradition. The Greeks told the story of Bacchus and Philemon, a poor elderly couple who entertained the gods Jupiter and Mercury unawares and were rewarded with their greatest wish, which was to die together. Abraham and Sarah, also an elderly couple, were good to visiting angels and were rewarded with a baby, their first. Sarah laughed. She was 90. The Chinese dragon of Wu, as you may remember, rescued a village from invasion after arriving as a little man leaning on a bamboo staff at an inopportune time. These stories tell us many things. They tell us about the ethos, if not the history, of times past. They speak of our deep obligation to extend hospitality to the stranger, an obligation born not only out of the needs of the human community, but out of our own need to experience something and someone new. They speak of gifts that strangers bring. They tell us something about our own inner life, about how we help our friends, about how we experience growth. And they speak of the conditions of hospitality, which are not wealth and decorations, fine food or glorious surroundings, but an open heart to the stranger and an open mind to a new idea. Strangers. We're programmed to be wary of them, some of us more strongly than others, programmed not only by our parents' admonitions and our community spheres, but by our very genes. No sooner does a baby's maturing brain figure out that she is a separate creature from others than she develops stranger anxiety. One of the first things that happens to a frightened community is that they turn on the strangers amongst them. Post 9/11 America was not a good place to be a stranger. Perhaps because of our fear of strangers and our tendency to mistreat strangers is so strong in us, one of the common messages of the world's religions is to do just the opposite, to welcome the stranger, to offer hospitality to the traveler, to think of strangers not as threatening, but as interesting, and the opportunity to know them as possibly enriching. This is hard work. The care of strangers is one of those biblical values that makes people nervous rather than warm and fuzzy. Most of us are not confronted by wayfarers at our doors, so at the literal level, the stories of wandering gods and traveling royalty don't touch us. However, we are all, to some extent at least, strangers to each other. And while we rarely confront strangers asking our hospitality, we are more often and more urgently confronted with people we don't know and ideas which are new and strange to us than any humans who have ever lived. Our genetic code programs us for villages, groups of 50 people or so whom we know well, perhaps a few other 100 others that we know a little bit, and have known all our lives, and who are fundamentally like us. That's where the human animal spent most of its evolutionary time. But our lives today, those of us who are out and about see and mostly ignore hundreds of people a day. Even in our own churches, we don't know everybody. We feel safe here anyway. But most of us head for people we know when we come in. Do you realize that church is one of the few places in most of our lives where we regularly, happily greet, shake hands with, and smile at perfect strangers? Why do we do this odd thing? We know that few of you will make your best friends that way. You probably don't even exchange names when you greet those around you each Sunday. Why do we do it? Why does it feel kind of good to do it? I think it is because it is so unique in our lives. I think it feels good to be reassured that the world's strangers are really okay. A community disaster brings out something of that same benefit. The needs of the moment mean that strangers work together and help each other, and it feels good, even at third hand from our TV sets, to see this in action. It makes us feel that all is well with the world. But these are fleeting moments in our lives, and unless we take trouble to practice what is really a spiritual discipline, as well as the advice of world's faiths, to be kind to strangers, to be curious rather than condemning, and therefore able to receive their gifts. Taken metaphorically, these stories about strangers at our dinner table or our birthplaces don't mean just people strangers. The strangers you are most in need of greeting in your life could be a new idea, a dream, a risk. Perhaps the stranger at your door is a transgender colleague, or the nagging feeling that you need to rethink what you always believed about God or immigration or tax policy or your retirement plans. And then, of course, there's the strangest stranger of all, the one inside us that we don't know, the stranger within, the one whose anger surprises us, whose strength saves us, whose slips embarrass us, whose misdeeds can bring us down. That's a stranger worth knowing. And when we know him or her, we're less likely to be hijacked by their frantic bids for attention. The stranger in your life could be a grief, a depression, an unwelcome development. Will you slam the door? Can you be curious? Is there anything to learn? The Muslim poet Rumi wrote about these kinds of strangers in his poem, The Guest House. This being human, he wrote, is a guest house. Each morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from the beyond. It is so hard to remember that wisdom when we're in the thick of our challenges and our miseries, when we've had just enough in our lives and not really quite enough more for that unwelcome visitor. And there's very little in our cultural wisdom right now to remind us to make room. We have to remember these old stories, the foreign poems, the ancient scriptures, or we miss all kinds of opportunities for growth, comfort, and the strength to get through long, hard winters. Strangers also come to us in the form of new ideas and newfangled things. Keeping our hearts open to these new ideas and things is one of the two basics of religious liberalism. The second is individualism. We talk about that a lot, that nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of our own hearts and minds. This morning we'll talk about the first basic. Revelation is not sealed. Conservative religion looks to truth in old books, in established wisdom, in time-honored doctrines. Religious liberals find these things interesting and sometimes instructive. But we look also to today's wisdom, to our own intuition, to modern poetry, to today's wise teachers. There's not much in the Bible that tells an egalitarian modern family how to live, because that's not what they were doing back then. Some faiths struggle with this. We, not very much. We look to modern sources and wisdom and experience for this rather than struggling with scriptures. We religious liberals have less trouble with the new than more conservative people. Novelty excites us. rather than scares us. You'll be interested to know that this preference for novelty and relative insensitivity to threat and danger are a part of the human genetic makeup. And the difference between people in these matters is bone deep. It matters of how our genetic makeup wires our brains and endocrine systems, matters of dopamine and serotonin, the body's alert and reward systems. You'll also be interested to know that if a person's genetic makeup is pro-novelty, they're more likely to be politically and religiously liberal than if their makeup gives them a high sensitivity to danger and a low interest in novelty, which would make them more likely to be politically and religiously conservative. And you thought you were just smarter, didn't you? It's a lot more complicated than that. Conservatives also think they're smarter than liberals, and they think they're also more realistic, less flighty, and more centered. But it's no accident of history that political liberals tend to look on social diversity as a generally good thing, while conservatives see social diversity as threatening. That liberals see immigration as an issue to be managed, while conservatives want all those strangers to just go away, or at least start acting like real Americans and less like strangers. So political and religious liberals have a leg up on welcoming the stranger, staying open to new ideas, and even to recognizing the stranger within themselves. But we still have to work at it, don't we? How do you treat a stranger, be it a strange person or a strange idea? All the old traditions agree on this. Easy or hard, we should pay heed. We treat the stranger with hospitality. You invite them in. You feed them. You converse. You get to know them. Sometimes, even these days, the strangers who come into our lives are people. One such stranger was a news item last week. A man presumed to be homeless, walking the streets of New York with no shoes. A kindly policeman bought that stranger a pair of boots, and they both became overnight sensations. And then, as you probably know, the story got more complicated. The man hid his boots away and continued in barefoot mode. He was struggling with mental illness. A holiday feel-good story got complicated. It often happens that way when it comes to strangers. It doesn't change anything about how they should be treated with hospitality. We do what we're supposed to do, and if there are unintended consequences, we deal with them. I had a stranger in my life for a decade. Her name was Tammy. She moved here from New York, from a UU church there. She moved here to escape family and stress, which had exacerbated very serious mental illness. She came to church here a few times. And then she lived in her car in the parking lot for a while and eventually was hospitalized. She thought she was dying and wanted to apologize to me personally for using so much of the church's resources without permission. Her first gift to me was an eye-opening set of lessons about how insecure our buildings are and what goes on this property when we're not here. Against expectation, Tammy didn't die. And over the next few months, I accompanied her on a terrible but enlightening journey of homelessness, mental illness, and social services. Now, I have to tell you, rarely does a week go by as your minister that I don't have to say to a stranger, we have a food bank, we have a list of shelters, that's all we can do for you. It's not a fun part of working in a church. All our staff have that burden, but it's a necessary one. I don't actually have any trouble saying no, but for some reason, I never said no to Tammy. I felt a call to be in her life that was almost mystical in force, and for 10 years, she was my visiting stranger. She taught me everything that I personally know about being poor, about keeping your dignity when you're dependent, about being generous when you have nothing. She involved me in the maze of Social Security and Section 8 housing and health care for the homeless, but she also involved me in her project to introduce Santa Claus to the children of her immigrant neighbors who'd been told by their parents that Santa only visits Americans. She taught me more than I want to know about intractable mental illness and even physical illness, which comes from a life of enduring abuse. She taught me about the attempt of suicide, the impulse to suicide. I never imagined that I understood her. I learned to relate to her without ever being sure she was telling me the truth. And William and I looked after her in fits and starts for nearly a decade, always her last bit of safety net in a hard world. She remained a stranger, but she was always a stranger who came bearing gifts. She died last spring. I wonder now, who will keep me on my toes in this privileged life? Hospitality to strangers, you see, is not mere entertainment. At least not the kind of entertainment which offers tidbits, intoxicants, and superficial conversation with people who are too much like ourselves. Hospitality is something different altogether. It's not a fullness, but an emptiness. Not noisy, but quiet. Not busy, but attentive. Not a cozy assumption that we're all the same, but a careful attentiveness to human difference. Our lives are often so full during the holidays that there's no room for others, sometimes not even room for ourselves. If our holiday season is planned and orchestrated with an inch of its life, there's no place for the unexpected, the strange, the wonderful. We will miss opportunities to meet strangers. Have faith. Leave some space for you, for others. My favorite hymn in Advent is People Look East, because it captures that open anticipation of the season. Something's on the way and we need to prepare, not only set the table and clear the house, but to recognize the spiritual truth that hidden in the bare ground is a precious seed that will grow, and that in the dark of the night there is one more star that will light our lives, that love, the guest, the stranger, is on the way. Let's sing it. Please stand.